3 cycles ago, the Galactic Salvage Consortium made what they thought was their smartest business decision ever. They were wrong, dead wrong. And I, Zara-Ka of the Fourth Nest, had the misfortune of witnessing the entire catastrophe unfold from the beginning. You see, when the war criminals of the Helix Syndicate were finally brought to justice, their assets went up for auction. Ships, weapons, slaves, everything had to go. The consortium thought they were being clever, selling off the smaller vessels to backwater species who couldn't afford the premium lots. What they didn't realize was that one particular human named Jake Morrison would walk away with more than just a beat-up cargo hauler. He walked away with me. Now, before you start making assumptions, let me clarify something. I wasn't some helpless prisoner waiting for rescue. I was a Kytherian battle maiden, trained since hatching to wage war across 17 star systems. My claws could tear through reinforced titanium, my venom could drop a Gorvac in 3 seconds flat, and my tactical knowledge had helped win the siege of Mortar Prime. But according to the auction paperwork, I was miscellaneous cargo, Lot 47. The insult still burns. Jake Morrison stood barely 6 feet tall, covered in the pale, soft skin that made humans look like walking medical emergencies. His brown hair stuck up at odd angles, and he wore clothing that looked like it had been assembled from spare parts. When he raised his paddle for my ship, the starbound wreck, every other bidder in the auction house started laughing. 10,000 credits for that rust bucket? Wheezed Commodore Vax of the Titan fleet. Human, you'd be better off buying a coffin and saving yourself the trouble. Jake just smiled. Oh, that smile! If I had known then what that expression meant, I would have broken my restraints and fled the auction house screaming. But hindsight is a luxury reserved for survivors. Sold, announced the auctioneer. A greasy Felonian who looked like he'd been dipped in motor oil. Lot 47, salvage vessel starbound wreck. To the human bidder for 10,000 credits. Please note that all sales include any remaining cargo or accessories. Accessories. They called me an accessory. When Jake came aboard to inspect his purchase, I was chained in the cargo hold, wearing the neural suppressor collar that kept my combat implants offline. Standard procedure for dangerous cargo, though the irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, a warrior who had personally executed the war criminal Dex Camor, being treated like a broken piece of equipment. Well, hello there, Jake said, crouching down to my eye level. Looks like you come with the ship. I fixed him with my most intimidating stare, the one that had made enemy commanders wet themselves in fear. Human, you have made a grave error. I am Zara-Ka, Sword of the Fourth Nest, Breaker of Chains, Terror of the Void. Release me and I may allow you to live. He blinked once, twice, then burst out laughing. Laughing, a decorated war hero. Lady, I just spent my life savings on a ship that's probably held together with prayer and duct tape. The last thing I'm worried about is an angry, what are you exactly? Some kind of space lizard. Space lizard. Space lizard. I decided right then that I was going to kill him. Slowly, maybe feed him to the scavenger worms of Keth Minor. But first, I needed out of these restraints. I am Kytherian, I said through gritted fangs. And if you possess even a shred of intelligence, you will free me immediately. Sure thing, Jake said, reaching for the collar's release mechanism. But let's get one thing straight. This is my ship now, which makes you my, well, I guess my co-pilot. Partner? Wife? Wife? The word came out as a screech that probably damaged his primitive human hearing. Hey, according to the auction house, you come with the ship. That makes you mine, right? And humans have this tradition where, he paused, studying my expression. Okay, maybe we should start with introductions. I'm Jake Morrison, former cargo pilot, current owner of the worst investment in galactic history. The collar clicked open, and I felt my combat systems humming back to life. Every instinct screamed at me to strike, to show this pathetic creature what happened when you insulted a Kytherian warrior. But something stopped me. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the fact that he'd actually released me without demanding guarantees for his safety. Or maybe it was the way he looked at me. Not with fear. Not with disgust. not with the calculating appraisal of someone sizing up a commodity. Just interest, like I was a person worth knowing. Why? I asked, flexing my claws to work out the stiffness. Why free me? Jake shrugged. Seems like the decent thing to do. Besides, if you wanted to kill me, you'd have done it already. Probably in some horrifically creative way that would make for great dinner conversation. He wasn't wrong. I could have snapped his neck 3 different ways in the time it took him to finish that sentence. But something about his casual acceptance of danger intrigued me. Most species treated Kytherians like walking catastrophes, which, to be fair, we usually were. So, Jake continued, settling down on a nearby crate like he didn't have a care in the universe. What's your story? What did you call yourself? Sword of the Fourth Nest? How does someone like you end up as cargo on a salvage ship? And despite every tactical principle I'd ever learned, despite the voice in my head screaming that this human was either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid, I found myself talking. I told him about the war, how the Helix Syndicate had terrorized the outer colonies for 3 decades, enslaving entire species and stripping worlds bare for resources, how the Kytherian Military Council had finally decided enough was enough, and joined the coalition of free worlds in their desperate campaign to stop the madness. I told him about the Battle of Nexus 7, where I'd led a strike team through a Syndicate dreadnought to assassinate their fleet commander. About the siege of their fortress world, where I'd held a choke point for 6 hours against wave after wave of enemy troops while evacuation ships escaped with rescued prisoners. And I told him about the mission that ended it all. How we'd tracked the Syndicate's leadership to their hidden base in the Shattered Belt. How everything had gone wrong when their security AI had detected our infiltration. How I'd been captured while covering the retreat of my squad. They kept me alive because they thought I had strategic information. I finished, staring at the deck plating. Spent 2 months trying to break me before the coalition finally overran their base. By then, the Syndicate leadership was dead. Their fleet scattered, and I was just another piece of evidence to be catalogued and sold off. Jake was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its casual humor. It's seriously messed up. They treated you like property. Welcome to galactic justice, I said bitterly. The victors get to decide who's a person and who's cargo. Well, Jake said, standing up and extending his hand toward me, as far as I'm concerned, you're a person. A scary, probably dangerous person, but still a person. And people don't belong to other people. I stared at his outstretched hand. Such a simple gesture, but loaded with meaning. In Kytherian culture, accepting an offered hand was a sign of mutual respect between equals. This human couldn't know that. But somehow the instinct was there. I took his hand. So, Jake said, with that dangerous smile returning. Partners? Partners. I agreed, though I still wasn't entirely sure I wouldn't kill him later. That was 3 months ago. 3 months of traveling the outer rim together, taking whatever cargo jobs we could find to keep the starbound wreck running. 3 months of learning that humans were even stranger than their reputation suggested. Jake Morrison was definitely not what anyone would call a typical human. Where most of his species were cautious to the point of paranoia, he seemed to actively seek out danger. He'd take cargo runs through pirate-infested systems without batting an eye, then spend an hour worrying about whether he'd offended me by eating the last protein bar. He was also surprisingly competent. The starbound wreck might have looked like a flying scrap heap, but Jake had rebuilt most of her systems himself. The ship could outrun military patrol boats and hide from sensor sweeps that would spot a cloaked assassin. More than once his modifications had saved our lives. But it was his attitude toward violence that really confused me. Most species fell into one of 2 categories when it came to warfare. Either they were natural predators who reveled in combat, or they were prey species who avoided it at all costs. Humans seemed to exist in some bizarre middle ground. They were obviously capable of incredible violence. Their history was littered with conflicts that made Kytherian blood duels look like friendly disagreements. But they also seemed to genuinely prefer peace. Jake was a perfect example. I'd seen him talk his way out of confrontations that would have ended in bloodshed for any other species. But I'd also seen what happened when talking failed. The incident on Trader's Rest had been educational. We'd been loading cargo when a gang of Rex mercenaries decided they wanted our ship. Not unusual, the starbound wreck might have looked worthless, but her hidden modifications made her valuable to the right buyer. What was unusual was their approach. Human, the gang leader had rumbled. All 8 feet of armored muscle and bad attitude. You will surrender your vessel. We have use for it. Sorry, Jake had replied with that same easy smile. But she's not for sale. Maybe try the scrapyard down the street. The Vrex had laughed, a sound like grinding metal. You misunderstand. This is not a negotiation. That's when things got interesting. I'd started to reach for my weapons, ready to show these amateurs what a real warrior looked like. But Jake held up a hand, still smiling. Hold on, he'd said to me, then turned back to the Rex. Before we do this, can I ask you guys a question? Do you know what humans are famous for? The gang leader had looked confused. Your persistence? Nope, Jake said cheerfully. We're famous for being really, really good at killing things. It's kind of our specialty. And then he'd moved. I'd trained with some of the fastest warriors in the galaxy, but I'd never seen anything like what Jake did to those mercenaries. No wasted motion, no hesitation, no mercy. In under 30 seconds, 4 armed Rex were unconscious on the deck, and their leader was staring down the barrel of Jake's sidearm with a look of absolute terror in his 6 eyes. Now, Jake had said, his voice never losing that friendly tone, I'm going to pretend this was all a misunderstanding. You're going to take your friends and leave, and if I ever see you again, I'm going to show you exactly why humans conquered half the galaxy before we got bored and decided to play nice. Are we clear? The Vrix had nodded frantically and dragged his unconscious companions away. Later, when I'd asked Jake where he'd learned to fight like that, he'd just shrugged. Military service, he'd said. Spent 6 years as a Marine before I got into cargo hauling. Turns out the skills transfer pretty well. Marines. I'd heard of human Marines. Every military officer in the galaxy had heard of human Marines. They were the ones who'd broken the siege of Arcturus. The ones who'd held the line at Blood River while civilian transports evacuated 3 million refugees. The ones who'd earned the grudging respect of even the most warlike species in the galaxy. And one of them was my partner. Jake, I'd said carefully, exactly what kind of cargo pilot were you before you bought this ship? His smile had turned slightly predatory. The kind that made deliveries to war zones. Which brought us to our current situation. 3 months of partnership, 3 months of successful cargo runs. 3 months of relative peace. We should have known it wouldn't last. The message came through our encrypted comm channel just as we were preparing to jump to hyperspace. Standard contract offer. Good pay, simple pickup and delivery. The only unusual thing was the pickup location. Omega Station, deep in the contested territory between the Terran Federation and the Kytherian Empire. Contested territory was a polite way of saying active war zone. We shouldn't take this job, I told Jake as he reviewed the contract details. Omega Station is too close to the front lines. Too much risk for not enough reward. 500,000 credits, Jake said, highlighting the payment amount. For a simple cargo run. When was the last time you saw numbers like that for legitimate work? Never, I admitted. Which is exactly why we shouldn't take it. Nobody pays that much for legitimate cargo. Jake leaned back in his pilot's chair, studying the star charts. Or somebody's desperate enough to pay premium rates for reliable transport. Look at the pickup coordinates. Omega Station is barely hanging on. They probably can't get regular shipping companies to risk the trip. He had a point. Omega Station was one of the last independent outposts in the sector, stubbornly maintaining neutrality while 2 galactic powers fought over everything around it. They'd been cut off from regular supply lines for months. Besides, Jake continued, we're almost broke. The reactor needs new containment coils. The hyperdrive is held together with spare parts and hope, and I'm pretty sure the life support system is plotting against us. We need this job. I couldn't argue with his logic. The starbound wreck was a good ship, but she required constant maintenance to stay functional. And maintenance required credits we didn't have. Fine, I said finally. But we go in armed and ready for trouble. Always do, Jake replied, already programming the navigation computer. Besides, what's the worst that could happen? Famous last words. The jump to Omega Station took 18 hours, plenty of time to prepare for whatever we might find. I spent the time checking our weapons and defensive systems, while Jake reviewed everything he could find about current military movements in the sector. What we learned wasn't encouraging. The war between the Terran Federation and the Kytherian Empire had been raging for 2 years now, ever since a diplomatic incident on the border world of Haven's Gate had spiraled out of control. Both sides claimed the other had fired first. Both sides were probably right, knowing the way these things usually went. But this wasn't just another territorial dispute. The Federation and the Empire had been circling each other like predators for decades, waiting for an excuse to settle old grudges. When it finally came, they'd thrown everything they had into the fight. Entire star systems had been turned into battlefields. Millions of civilians had been caught in the crossfire, and sitting right in the middle of it all was Omega Station, trying to stay neutral while chaos raged around it. "Incoming transmission," Jake announced as we dropped out of hyperspace. "Omega Station traffic control." The main screen flickered to life, showing a harried-looking Centaurian with stress marks around his 4 eyes. "Unidentified vessel. This is Omega Station Control. State your business and prepare for inspection." "This is cargo hauler Starbound Wreck," Jake replied. "We're here for a pickup. Contract number Alpha 779. The controller checked his records, his expression growing more concerned. "Confirmed, Starbound Wreck. Proceed to Docking Bay 12. But be advised, we've had 3 pirate raids in the last week, and long-range sensors are showing Federation patrol activity in the outer system. You might want to make this quick." "Copy that, Control. Thanks for the warning." As we approached the station, I could see why the controller looked worried. Omega Station showed signs of recent combat damage. Scorch marks on the hull, hastily patched holes where weapons fire had penetrated the outer shell, and at least 2 docking bays that looked completely destroyed. "Friendly neighborhood," Jake muttered, bringing us in for a gentle landing in Bay 12. The docking bay was nearly empty, just a few small ships that looked like they'd seen better decades. Most of the station's regular traffic had probably fled when the shooting started. Smart of them. Our contact was waiting at the airlock when we docked. Human, middle-aged, wearing the kind of nondescript clothes that screamed intelligence operative to anyone with military training. He had the look of someone who'd spent too many years in dark places doing things he didn't want to talk about. "You Morrison?" he asked without preamble. "That's me," Jake replied. "You're the one with the cargo?" "Name's Collins. And yeah, I've got your cargo. But first, we need to talk." He led us through the station's corridors, past shops and cafes that had clearly seen better days. Most were closed, their owners probably evacuated when the war reached this sector. The few people we did see moved quickly and avoided eye contact, the behavior of civilians who'd learned to expect trouble. Collins brought us to a small office in the commercial district, the kind of place that rented by the hour to traders who needed privacy for sensitive negotiations. Once the door was sealed, he activated a privacy screen that would block electronic surveillance. "Before we proceed," he said, studying both of us carefully, "I need to know something. How do you two feel about stopping a war?" I felt my combat instincts surge to full alert. "Explain." Collins reached into his jacket and pulled out a data pad, which he placed on the table between us. 3 days ago, Federation intelligence intercepted communications from a Kytherian strike fleet. They're planning something called Operation Crimson Dawn. Ring any bells? The blood in my veins turned to ice. "That's impossible. Operation Crimson Dawn was cancelled, was it?" Collins asked. "Because according to our intelligence, a Kytherian battle group is currently en route to the Terran colony world of New Geneva. Population, 4.7 million civilians. Estimated time of arrival 36 hours. I stared at the datapad, my mind racing. Operation Crimson Dawn had been one of the Empire's most classified military strategies, a plan to end the war quickly by targeting civilian population centers and forcing the Federation to surrender. It was also completely insane. The Military Council would never authorize that, I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I wasn't entirely sure. War had a way of making people desperate, and desperate people did terrible things. "Maybe they didn't authorize it," Collins said. Maybe someone's gone rogue. Either way, 4.7 million people are about to die unless we can stop it. Jake had been silent during this exchange, but now he leaned forward. What kind of cargo are we supposed to be carrying? Collins smiled grimly. The only thing that can prevent a massacre. Proof that Operation Crimson Dawn isn't what it seems to be. Proof? I repeated, tasting the word like poison. What kind of proof? Collins activated the datapad, and a holographic display materialized above the table. Star charts, military deployment patterns, communication intercepts, the kind of intelligence that people killed and died for every single day in this cursed war. 6 weeks ago, Collins began. A Federation deep-cover operative managed to infiltrate the Kytherian High Command. What she found was disturbing. The display shifted, showing what looked like official Kytherian military orders. My trained eye picked out the authentication codes, the command structure, the operational parameters. Everything looked legitimate. Everything except the content. Operation Crimson Dawn calls for the systematic elimination of civilian targets, Collins continued. Not military bases, not strategic installations. Schools, hospitals, refugee camps. The plan is to break Federation morale by making the cost of continued resistance unbearable. Jake whistled low. That's not warfare, that's genocide. Exactly, Collins said. And here's the interesting part. According to our intelligence, the operation was ordered by someone calling themselves the Voice of Vengeance. Not the military council, not the Emperor himself. Someone operating completely outside the normal chain of command. I felt my blood pressure spiking. The Voice of Vengeance was a name from Kytherian mythology, an ancient legend about a warrior who would arise in the Empire's darkest hour to cleanse the galaxy of its enemies. It was also complete nonsense. The kind of story parents told hatchlings to make them sleep better. You're suggesting someone is using religious extremism to justify mass murder. I said carefully. I'm not suggesting anything, Collins replied. I'm telling you that in 34 hours a Kytherian battle group is going to arrive at New Geneva and start killing civilians. Unless we can prove that this whole operation is a rogue action that doesn't represent the legitimate government of the Kytherian Empire. The pieces were starting to fall into place, and I didn't like the picture they were forming. The cargo. It's evidence of this conspiracy. Data cores recovered from a destroyed Kytherian command ship, Collins confirmed. Communication logs, financial records, personnel files. Everything we need to prove that Operation Crimson Dawn is the work of a small group of extremists, not an official military action. Jake leaned back in his chair, studying the intelligence officer with the expression he usually reserved for particularly dangerous cargo runs. And you need us to transport this evidence because every official channel has been compromised, Collins said bluntly. We've lost 3 courier ships in the last week. Federation intelligence thinks there's a mole in their organization. The only way to get this information to the right people is through an independent operator with no official connections. An expendable operator, I corrected. Collins had the grace to look uncomfortable. I won't lie to you. This is dangerous. If the conspirators realize what we're carrying, they'll do everything in their power to stop us. And I mean everything. Define everything, Jake said. Assassination squads. Sabotage. Bribery. Threats against anyone you've ever cared about. Collins paused. And if all else fails, they'll probably just blow up your ship and claim it was a pirate attack. I had to admire his honesty. Most intelligence types would have sugar-coated the danger, made it sound like a routine delivery run with maybe some minor complications. Collins was laying out the stakes with brutal clarity. Why us? I asked. There must be other independent operators available. Because you're the only team in this sector with both the skills and the motivation to see this through, Collins replied. Jake Morrison, former Federation Marine, decorated veteran of the Proxima campaign, Zara-Ka of the Fourth Nest, hero of the Coalition Wars, personally responsible for ending the Helix Syndicate's reign of terror. You've both seen what happens when extremists are allowed to run unchecked. He wasn't wrong. I'd spent months hunting down Syndicate war criminals, and Jake had fought against their slave raids in the outer colonies. We both knew the cost of letting fanatics have their way. The payment, Jake said. 500,000 credits is a lot of money for a simple delivery run. It's hazard pay, Collins admitted. And frankly, it's probably not enough, but it's all we have. I exchanged glances with Jake. In the 3 months we'd been partners, we'd developed a kind of shorthand communication. The slight tilt of his head meant he was interested but cautious. The way he drummed his fingers on the table meant he thought this was probably a trap but might be worth the risk anyway. My own instincts were screaming contradictory messages. The logical part of my mind said this was obviously a setup, that intelligence officers didn't just hand out classified information to freelance cargo haulers, but the warrior part of my mind was already planning assault routes and escape vectors, treating this like any other combat mission. "Where do we deliver the cargo?" I asked. "Sanctuary Station," Collins replied. "Neutral territory, secure communication facilities, and home to the only remaining diplomatic mission trying to negotiate a ceasefire. If we can get this evidence to Ambassador Chen, she can present it to both sides simultaneously." Jake frowned. "Sanctuary Station is 3 days away through some of the most heavily patrolled space in the galaxy. Both sides will have interdiction fleets covering every approach route, which is why we're not taking the direct approach," Collins said with a thin smile. "I've arranged for a diversion. In 6 hours, a Federation task force is going to stage a fake attack on the Kytherian supply depot at Morse 7. While both sides are busy shooting at each other, you'll have a clear run through the Nebula Passage." The Nebula Passage. Even the name made my scales itch. It was a narrow corridor of navigable space threading through the Crimson Nebula, barely wide enough for a single ship and filled with enough electromagnetic interference to scramble most sensor systems. Ships went into the passage and sometimes didn't come out. "You want us to fly through a navigation hazard that's killed more pilots than enemy action," I said flatly. "I want you to use the passage's reputation to your advantage," Collins corrected. "No sane military commander would send a patrol through there. It's the one route that's guaranteed to be unguarded." "There's a reason it's unguarded," Jake pointed out. "Most ships that try to navigate the passage end up as space debris. Most ships aren't piloted by a former Marine with navigation skills that border on the supernatural," Collins replied smoothly. "According to your service record, you once flew a damaged transport through an asteroid field while under enemy fire. The passage should be a relaxing cruise by comparison." I had to admit, Collins had done his homework. Jake's piloting abilities were genuinely impressive, even by Kytherian standards. If anyone could thread a cargo hauler through the Nebula Passage, it would be him. "Show us the cargo," I said finally. Collins led us deeper into the station, through corridors that had clearly seen recent combat, blast marks on the walls, emergency bulkheads sealed with quick-patch foam, the acrid smell of burned electronics hanging in the recycled air. Whatever had happened here, it had been violent and recent. "Pirate raid?" Jake asked, noting the damage. "Worse," Collins replied grimly. 3 days ago, a Kytherian strike team tried to board the station. They were after the same data cores we're giving you. They knew about the cargo. They knew something valuable was here. The strike team was led by someone calling himself the Sword of Retribution. Ring any bells? My blood turned to ice in my veins. The Sword of Retribution was another name from Kytherian mythology, supposedly the right hand of the Voice of Vengeance. If the conspirators were using those titles, they were either complete fanatics or very clever manipulators playing on religious fears. "Did they get what they came for?" I asked. "They tried," Collins said, stopping at a heavily reinforced door. "But the station's defenders held them off long enough to evacuate the critical data. Cost us 17 good people. But the cargo survived." He placed his palm on a biometric scanner, and the door slid open with a hiss of equalizing pressure. Inside was a small, sterile storage chamber containing a single metallic case about the size of a human briefcase. 3 terabytes of classified information, Collins said, lifting the case carefully. "Communication logs, financial transfers, personnel records, tactical plans. Everything we need to prove that Operation Crimson Dawn is a rogue operation." Jake examined the case's security features with professional interest. Military-grade encryption, anti-tamper devices, probably a self-destruct mechanism if someone tries to open it without the proper codes. All of the above, Collins confirmed. The case will only open for Ambassador Chen's biometric signature. Anyone else tries to crack it and the contents get reduced to their component atoms. Comforting, I muttered, accepting the case from Collins. It was heavier than it looked, probably due to all the security hardware packed inside. One more thing, Collins said as we prepared to leave. You're not the only ones who know about this cargo. We've intercepted communications suggesting that both sides have assets in the field trying to track down these data cores, Federation Black Ops teams, Kytherian special forces, maybe even freelance assassins working for the highest bidder. In other words, Jake said, everyone in the galaxy wants to kill us. Pretty much, Collins admitted. But look on the bright side. If you succeed, you'll have prevented the massacre of 4.7 million civilians and possibly ended the war. And if we fail? Collins shrugged. Then I guess we'll all have front-row seats to watch the galaxy tear itself apart. 20 minutes later, we were back aboard the starbound wreck, preparing for the most dangerous cargo run of our careers. I'd secured the data case in our ship's vault, a reinforced compartment that could survive everything short of a direct hit from a fusion torpedo. Jake was running pre-flight diagnostics on all our systems, making sure we were ready for whatever the next 3 days might throw at us. You know, Jake said as he reviewed the navigation data for the Nebula Passage, when I bought this ship, I thought the most dangerous thing I'd have to worry about was avoiding customs inspectors. Life has a way of exceeding our expectations, I replied, checking the charge on my plasma rifle. Usually in the worst possible way. Any regrets about taking this job? I considered the question seriously. 3 months ago, I'd been a prisoner, treated like cargo by the same people who were supposed to represent justice in the galaxy. Now I was about to risk my life to save millions of civilians from a war that wasn't even my fight. Ask me again when we reach Sanctuary Station, I said finally. Jake's smile had an edge to it that reminded me why human Marines were feared across the galaxy. Fair enough. But for what it's worth, I think we're doing the right thing. The right thing, I repeated. Humans and your obsession with moral absolutes. Hey, it's worked out pretty well for us so far. That was debatable, but I didn't feel like arguing philosophy while we were preparing for a suicide mission. Instead, I focused on reviewing our defensive options. The starbound wreck wasn't a warship, but Jake's modifications had given her teeth, hidden weapon ports, military-grade shields, a sensor suite that could spot trouble before trouble spotted us. Incoming transmission, Jake announced from the pilot's station. It's Collins. The intelligence officer's face appeared on our main screen, looking even more haggard than before. Bad news, he said without preamble. Long-range sensors just picked up a Kytherian patrol squadron entering the system. 3 destroyers and a light cruiser, running a standard search pattern. They're looking for us? I asked. Unknown, but we have to assume the worst. They're currently 6 hours out from Omega Station, but that patrol pattern will bring them close to your planned departure route. Jake was already adjusting our flight plan, his fingers dancing over the navigation controls. We can avoid them if we leave now and take the long way around the system's outer edge. It'll add 2 hours to our trip, but it's better than getting into a firefight with a cruiser. Agreed, Collins said. But be aware that Federation intelligence is reporting unusual communication traffic in this sector. Someone's coordinating a massive search operation, and it's not following normal military protocols. The conspirators, I said. They know we have the cargo. That's my assessment, Collins confirmed. Which means you can expect company long before you reach the Nebula Passage. Stay alert, trust no one, and remember that you're carrying the only evidence that can prevent a massacre. The transmission ended, leaving us alone with the weight of our responsibility. 4.7 million lives depending on a cargo run through hostile space. No pressure at all. Think they'll really try to stop us? Jake asked as he initiated the departure sequence. They've already killed 3 courier ships, I pointed out. I doubt they'll hesitate to make it 4. Good point. Jake's hands moved over the control panels with practiced efficiency, bringing the starbound wreck's systems online. Better strap in. This is going to be interesting. As we lifted off from Omega Station, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Not by sensors or surveillance equipment, but by something more primal. The predatory awareness of a hunter tracking its prey. Jake, I said as we cleared the station's traffic control zone, do you ever get the feeling that the universe is actively trying to kill you? Every day, he replied cheerfully. But here's the thing about the universe. It might be big, and it might be mean, but it's also really, really slow. As long as we keep moving, we should be fine. I hoped he was right. But as we accelerated toward the edge of the system, I couldn't help but notice the way his hands lingered near the weapon controls. Whatever Jake Morrison's optimism might suggest, he was preparing for a fight. The next 6 hours passed in tense silence as we skirted the edge of the Omega system, avoiding the main shipping lanes and keeping our sensor signature as low as possible. The Starbound Wreck's stealth modifications were good, but they weren't perfect. If someone was actively looking for us, they'd find us eventually. Contact, Jake announced suddenly. 2 ships running silent about 30,000 kilometers off our port bow. I checked the tactical display, studying the sensor ghost that had appeared on our screens. The ships were trying to hide their signatures, but their mass was too large to completely mask. Definitely military vessels, probably destroyers based on their size and configuration. Federation or Kytherian? I asked. Unknown, Jake replied, adjusting our course to give the contacts a wider berth. They're not broadcasting identification signals, and their emissions pattern is scrambled. Mercenaries, I concluded. Someone hired private muscle to intercept us. As if summoned by my words, our communication array lit up with an incoming transmission. Jake hesitated for a moment, then accepted the call. The face that appeared on our screen was human, but heavily scarred and augmented with military-grade cybernetics. The kind of modifications that marked someone as either a veteran of the nastiest conflicts in the galaxy or a complete psychopath. Possibly both. Cargo vessel Starbound Wreck. The scarred man said in a voice like grinding metal, "This is Captain Rex Vance of the Mercenary Squadron, Iron Fist. You are ordered to heave to and prepare for boarding." "Sorry," Jake replied with that same casual tone he'd used on the Rex gang. "But we're on a tight schedule. Maybe you could file a formal complaint with our insurance company." Vance's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered behind his augmented eyes. "This is not a request, Morrison. We know what you're carrying, and we know who hired you. Surrender the cargo peacefully and you might live long enough to spend that 500,000 credits. So much for operational security." Either Collins had been compromised or the conspiracy had intelligence sources we hadn't anticipated. Neither possibility was particularly comforting. "Counter-offer," Jake said, his hands moving toward the weapon controls. "You turn around and pretend you never saw us, and I don't have to explain to your employers why their expensive mercenaries got turned into space debris." This time Vance actually smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. "Morrison, you're flying a converted cargo hauler against 2 military destroyers. This is going to end exactly one way." "You know what?" Jake said, reaching for the communications cutoff switch. "You're absolutely right." The transmission ended and Jake's hands flew over the control panels. The Starbound Wreck's hidden weapon systems came online. Her defensive screens powered up to maximum, and her engines surged to combat power. "What's the plan?" I asked, checking the charge on our plasma cannons. "Simple," Jake replied, throwing the ship into a diving turn that would have liquefied most pilots. "We're going to do something they won't expect." "Which is?" Jake's smile was pure predator. "We're going to win." The first missile salvo came in exactly 37 seconds after communications ended. 12 high-yield warheads, launched from maximum range in a spread pattern designed to overwhelm our defensive systems. A textbook opening move that would have vaporized any normal cargo hauler. Unfortunately for Captain Vance, the Starbound Wreck was anything but normal. "Point defense online," I announced, my claws dancing over the weapons console as Jake threw us into an evasive spiral that would have torn apart a ship with standard structural reinforcement. "Targeting solutions locked." "Take them out," Jake ordered, his voice calm despite the fact that we were outnumbered 12 to 1 by weapons that could crack a moon. I triggered our hidden plasma batteries, and space lit up with coherent energy beams that turned incoming missiles into expanding clouds of superheated gas. The mercenaries had expected easy prey. Instead, they got a demonstration of what happened when you underestimated a partnership between a Kytherian battle maiden and a human marine. Impossible, Vance's voice crackled over the comm channel. Intelligence said you were flying an unarmed transport. Intelligence was wrong, Jake replied, rolling us through a corkscrew maneuver that brought our main guns to bear on the lead destroyer. About a lot of things. Our forward plasma cannons spoke with the voice of controlled nuclear fusion, sending twin lances of star-hot energy across 30,000 kilometers of space. The destroyer's shields flared and held, but I could see the power fluctuations on our sensors. They wouldn't stand up to sustained fire. Evasive action, Vance shouted to his wingman. But the mercenaries were already moving, spreading out to attack us from multiple angles. They're trying to bracket us, I warned, tracking their movement patterns. Standard hunter-killer formation. Let them, Jake said, adjusting our course toward the inner system. They're thinking like military pilots. We're not military anymore. He was right. Military doctrine called for standing your ground and trading fire until one side was destroyed. But we weren't trying to win a battle. We were trying to complete a mission. And sometimes the best way to win was to change the rules entirely. Jake dove the starbound wreck toward the system's primary star, using the gravity well to accelerate beyond anything the destroyers could match. It was a dangerous gambit. Get too close to the stellar photosphere and radiation would cook us alive, but it also meant the mercenaries couldn't use their most powerful weapons without risking collateral damage to themselves. He's insane, one of the mercenary pilots transmitted. No one flies that close to a star in anything less than a dreadnought. Morrison's not insane, Vance replied grimly. He's desperate. And desperate humans are the most dangerous things in the galaxy. The mercenary captain wasn't wrong. I'd seen desperate humans in action during the Coalition Wars, and they had a talent for pulling victory out of situations that should have been hopeless. But this wasn't desperation driving Jake Morrison. This was calculation, cold, precise, tactical thinking that treated the laws of physics like just another weapon in his arsenal. Radiation levels approaching critical, I announced as we skimmed the star's outer atmosphere, hull temperature rising beyond safe parameters. Hold together, old girl, Jake murmured to the ship, his hands steady on the controls despite the fact that we were literally flying through the edge of a nuclear furnace. Just a little bit longer. The starbound wreck groaned around us, her hull plating expanding from the heat, her cooling systems working overtime to keep us from being cooked alive. But Jake's modifications held. Whatever he'd done to this ship, she could take punishment that would destroy vessels twice her size. Behind us, the mercenary destroyers were falling back, their captains unwilling to follow us into the stellar fire. They were smart enough to know that chasing prey into a star was a good way to become part of the star yourself. They're pulling back, I reported, watching the tactical display. Not for long, Jake replied, pulling us out of the star's gravity well in a slingshot maneuver that added another 10% to our velocity. They'll reposition for an intercept course near the jump point. He was right, of course. The mercenaries might not be willing to follow us into a star, but they knew where we were going. The nebula passage had only one entrance, and they'd be waiting for us when we arrived. So what's the plan? I asked. Though I suspected I already knew. We go through them, Jake said simply. Through 2 military destroyers. Through, around, over, under, whatever it takes. I had to admire his confidence, even if I thought he was completely insane. But then again, insanity had served us well so far. Maybe it would get us through the next few hours alive. The flight to the nebula passage took another 3 hours. 3 hours of tension broken only by the occasional long-range sensor ping from our pursuers. They were keeping their distance, content to shadow us until we reached the trap they were undoubtedly preparing. You know, I said as we approached the passage entrance, most Kytherian warriors would consider this a glorious way to die. Outnumbered, outgunned, fighting against impossible odds for a noble cause. Most Kytherian warriors are idiots, Jake replied. No offense. None taken. You're not wrong. The nebula passage loomed ahead of us, a narrow corridor of navigable space threading through a cloud of ionized gas and electromagnetic interference. From the outside, it looked like the mouth of some cosmic predator, ready to swallow unwary ships whole. "Contact," I announced. "The destroyers are moving to intercept. They'll reach firing range in 7 minutes." "Perfect timing," Jake said, angling us toward the passage entrance. "They want to catch us before we can reach the nebula. That means they'll have to come in fast and hard." "Which gives us what advantage?" "Exactly." Jake's smile was sharp enough to cut hull plating. "They're going to be focused on us instead of watching where they're going." As we crossed into the nebula's outer boundary, our sensors immediately began experiencing interference from the ionized gas. Navigation became a matter of visual reference points and dead reckoning, exactly the kind of flying that separated competent pilots from dead ones. Behind us, the mercenary destroyers were closing fast, their weapons systems cycling to full power. They intended to finish this before we could disappear into the nebula's protective embrace. "Incoming fire," I warned, detecting the energy spikes that preceded weapons discharge. "Hold on," Jake said, and threw us into a diving turn that would have been impossible in normal space. The destroyer's plasma beams sliced through the space we'd occupied a split second before, their coherent energy dissipating harmlessly into the nebula's swirling gases. But the real show was just beginning. "Jake," I said, watching our tactical display with growing concern, "the nebula's electromagnetic field is interfering with their targeting systems." "I know," he replied, threading us between two massive gas formations that would have hidden a fleet. "They're firing blind." "I know. They could hit anything, including each other." "I really know." And that's exactly what happened. The second destroyer, trying to get a clear shot at us, moved into the firing line just as its partner triggered another salvo. High-energy plasma meant to vaporize the starbound wreck instead slammed into the destroyer's port shields, overloading them instantly and punching through to the hull beneath. "Friendly fire! Friendly fire!" one of the mercenary pilots screamed over the comm channel. "Hold your fire," Vance shouted back. "Maintain formation and track the target visually." But it was too late. The damaged destroyer was venting atmosphere and falling behind, its engines stuttering as emergency systems tried to compensate for the damage. And we were already disappearing into the nebula's depths where their sensors couldn't follow. "One down," Jake said with satisfaction. "One to go," I replied, though I had to admit his plan had worked perfectly. Human tactical thinking at its finest. Turn your enemy's aggression against them and let physics do the rest. Navigating the nebula passage turned out to be every bit as challenging as its reputation suggested. The corridor twisted and turned through the ionized gas, forcing us to constantly adjust course to avoid dead ends and gravitational anomalies. Twice we had to backtrack when Jake's chosen route led to impassable obstacles. Once we nearly flew into a rogue asteroid that our sensors hadn't detected until we were almost on top of it. "I'm beginning to understand why most ships avoid this place," I muttered as we squeezed through a gap barely wider than our hull. "Just think of it as job security," Jake replied, sweat beading on his forehead as he fought to keep us on course. "The more dangerous the route, the more valuable the pilots who can navigate it." Behind us, the remaining destroyer was following at a cautious distance, unwilling to close the gap but determined not to lose us entirely. Captain Vance had learned from his partner's mistake. He was content to shadow us through the passage and attack when we emerged into normal space. It was a smart plan. Unfortunately for him, we had no intention of letting him execute it. "How long until we reach the far end of the passage?" I asked, studying the navigation charts. "At current speed about 6 hours," Jake replied. "But we're not going to make it at current speed." "Explain." "The passage gets narrower as we go deeper. Eventually, we'll hit a section that's barely wide enough for a single ship. If we're still being followed when we reach that point," he didn't need to finish. I could see the tactical situation clearly enough. The destroyer would wait until we were committed to the narrow section, then open fire. We'd have nowhere to run and no room to maneuver. It would be like shooting fish in a barrel. "So we need to lose them before we reach the bottleneck," I concluded. "Or convince them to stop following us," Jake said thoughtfully. I didn't like the tone in his voice. It was the same tone he'd used right before he'd flown us through the edge of a star. "What are you thinking?" "Remember what Collins said about the passage's reputation? Ships go in and don't come out?" I remember. Want to know why that happens? Jake activated the long-range sensors, pushing them to maximum resolution despite the interference from the surrounding gas. What they showed made my blood run cold. Gravitational anomaly, I breathed, staring at the readings. Net ahead, right in the middle of the passage. Not just any gravitational anomaly, Jake corrected. A micro-black hole. Probably formed when the nebula's gas cloud collapsed a few million years ago. It's small, maybe 10 meters across, but it's got the mass of a small planet. I felt my scales ripple with involuntary fear. Black holes were the ultimate predators of space, devouring anything that came too close. Even a micro-black hole could tear apart a ship that approached its event horizon. We're turning around, I said firmly. Right now? No, Jake replied, studying the gravitational readings with the intensity of a man planning something incredibly stupid. We're going through a black hole. Jake, that's suicide. Not through it. Around it. There's a stable orbit about 50 kilometers from the event horizon. If we can hit it just right, we can use the black hole's gravity to slingshot ourselves toward the exit at twice our current speed. And if we miss, then we become a very thin layer of atoms stretched across several light-years of space. I stared at him in disbelief. You want to use a black hole as a slingshot? It's been done before, Jake said defensively. Theoretically. Theoretically. The math works out. The math for surviving a slingshot around a black hole. Trust me, 2 words that had gotten us into more trouble than I cared to remember. But looking at our tactical situation, I realized we didn't have much choice. The destroyer was still following us, and the passage was getting narrower with every kilometer. We needed to do something unexpected. Something that would either save us or kill us so quickly we wouldn't have time to regret it. Do it, I said finally. Jake nodded and began plotting our approach vector. The calculations were incredibly complex, requiring him to factor in the black hole's gravitational field, our ship's mass and velocity, the passage's geometry, and about a dozen other variables that could kill us if he got them wrong. Initiating approach, he announced, adjusting our course toward the invisible monster lurking in the nebula's heart. The gravitational effects began almost immediately. Our ship's hull creaked as tidal forces tried to stretch us apart, and I could feel my inner ear protesting as the changing gravity field confused my sense of direction. On the tactical display, space itself seemed to bend around the black hole's position. Detecting massive gravitational distortion, came a transmission from the pursuing destroyer. Recommend immediate course change. Negative, Vance replied. Maintain pursuit. They're trying to lose us in the interference. If only he knew. As we approached the black hole's gravity well, time itself began to behave strangely. Our chronometers slowed, then sped up, then slowed again as relativistic effects warped our frame of reference. I found myself holding my breath, afraid that even the slightest vibration might throw off Jake's calculations. Entering the gravity well, Jake announced, his voice strangely calm for someone threading a cargo hauler through one of the universe's most dangerous phenomena. All hands prepare for acceleration. The starbound wreck screamed around the black hole's edge, her hull groaning under gravitational stresses that should have torn her apart. For a terrifying moment I thought we were going too fast, that we'd spiral into the event horizon and disappear forever. But Jake's calculations held true. We whipped around the invisible destroyer and shot toward the passage exit like a bullet from a gun. Behind us, Captain Vance finally realized what we'd done. They're using the gravitational anomaly as a slingshot, he shouted over the comm channel, pulling back to safe distance. But it was too late. By the time the destroyer could change course, we were already beyond their sensor range, racing toward the passage exit at a velocity that made further pursuit impossible. Nebula passage transit complete, I announced 6 hours later as we emerged into normal space. No sign of pursuit. Sanctuary station is 4 hours away, Jake said, collapsing back in his pilot's seat with obvious relief. Think we'll make it? Ask me when we're docked, I replied. Though privately I had to admit our chances looked good. The hardest part was behind us. Now we just had to deliver the cargo and hope that Ambassador Chen could use it to prevent a massacre. Sanctuary station hung in space like a metallic flower, its rotating sections gleaming with the reflected light of the system's twin suns. As a neutral facility, It was one of the few places in the galaxy where representatives from warring factions could meet without immediately shooting each other. Today, it might be the place where a war finally ended. "Incoming transmission from Station Control," I announced as we approached the docking ring. "Cargo vessel starbound wreck," came a crisp professional voice. "This is Sanctuary Station Traffic Control. You are cleared for approach to Docking Bay 7. Be advised that this is a neutral facility operating under the protection of the Galactic Mediation Council. All weapons must be secured before docking." "Understood, Control," Jake replied. Weapons secured and locked down. As we settled into the docking bay, I could see the evidence of the station's neutrality everywhere. Federation and Kytherian ships docked side by side, their crews maintaining an uneasy truce under the watchful eyes of station security. It was probably the only place in the galaxy where such a sight was possible. Ambassador Chen was waiting for us at the airlock, a small, dignified woman with silver hair and the kind of eyes that had seen too much of war's brutality. She was flanked by security guards from both the Federation and the Empire, a symbolic gesture of the cooperation that peace would require. "Mr. Morrison, Miss Zara-Ka," she said formally. "I understand you have something for me." I retrieved the data case from our ship's vault, noting how the ambassador's security detail tensed as I approached. Trust was still a rare commodity in this war-torn galaxy. 3 terabytes of classified intelligence, I said, presenting the case. "Proof that Operation Crimson Dawn is not an official Kytherian military action." Ambassador Chen placed her palm on the case's biometric scanner. There was a soft chime, and the locks disengaged. Inside, nestled in protective foam, were 3 data cores that contained the evidence needed to prevent a massacre. "Fascinating," the ambassador murmured, as she reviewed the initial data summaries. Financial transfers from private accounts, communication logs using civilian encryption protocols, personnel records showing recruitment from extremist organizations rather than regular military units. "It's all there," I confirmed. "Operation Crimson Dawn is the work of a small group of fanatics operating outside the normal chain of command. They're using religious mythology and stolen military resources to pursue their own agenda." "The voice of vengeance," Chen said, reading from one of the files. "The sword of retribution. They're using ancient legends to justify modern atrocities." "Can you stop them?" Jake asked. "I can try," Chen replied, already activating her communication equipment. "If this evidence is genuine, I can present it to both sides simultaneously. The Federation will call off their retaliation, and the Kytherian Empire will disavow the operation. And if they don't believe you," Ambassador Chen's expression was grim, "then in 28 hours the colony world of New Geneva becomes a graveyard." The next few hours were tense with activity as Ambassador Chen worked to verify the intelligence and coordinate with representatives from both sides. I found myself pacing the station's observation deck, watching the stars and trying not to think about 4.7 million civilians who had no idea their lives hung in the balance. "You know," Jake said, joining me at the viewport, "when I bought that ship I never imagined I'd end up preventing galactic wars." "The universe has a sense of humor," I replied, "usually a very dark one. Any regrets?" I considered the question seriously. 3 months ago I'd been a prisoner abandoned by the same people I'd fought to protect. Today I'd helped expose a conspiracy that could have destroyed billions of lives. It wasn't the career path I'd planned, but it felt right in a way that formal military service never had. "No regrets," I said finally, "though I reserve the right to change my mind if someone tries to auction me off again." Jake laughed. "Deal, but just so you know, if anyone tries to buy you, they'll have to go through me first." "That's actually quite touching," I admitted. "For a human, coming from you, that's practically a declaration of undying loyalty." Before I could respond, Ambassador Chen's voice echoed through the station's communication system. "Attention all personnel," she announced. "I am pleased to report that representatives from both the Terran Federation and the Kytherian Empire have agreed to emergency ceasefire negotiations based on new evidence regarding Operation Crimson Dawn. The attack on New Geneva has been cancelled and both sides are working to identify and apprehend the extremist elements responsible for this conspiracy." The relief I felt was overwhelming. We'd actually done it, Against all odds, despite mercenary attacks and black hole navigation and enough bureaucratic obstacles to choke a space whale, we prevented a massacre. Not bad for a day's work, Jake said with satisfaction. Not bad at all, I agreed. 6 months later, we were sitting in a cantina on Trader's Rest, celebrating the completion of another successful cargo run. The war between the Federation and the Empire was over, ended by negotiations that had followed the exposure of the Crimson Dawn conspiracy. The extremists responsible had been arrested or killed, their network dismantled by joint task forces from both sides. And we were rich. The reward money from preventing a galactic catastrophe had been substantial enough to buy a new ship, upgrade our equipment, and establish ourselves as one of the most successful independent cargo operations in the sector. You know, Jake said, raising his glass in a toast, when I bought you at that auction, I thought I was getting a rusty old cargo hauler and maybe an interesting travel companion. And instead you got a rusty old cargo hauler and a partner, I replied, clinking my glass against his. Best investment I ever made. I had to agree. The galaxy was a dangerous place, full of pirates and extremists, and people who thought selling sentient beings was acceptable business practice. But it was also full of opportunities for those brave enough or stupid enough to seize them. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, you found someone worth sharing those opportunities with. So, Jake said, studying the cargo manifest for our next job, ready for another adventure? I looked at the destination coordinates, noted the hazard warnings and the suspiciously high payment rate, and smiled. Partner, I said, I thought you'd never ask.